The morning frost clung to the heather like silver lace, shimmering under a pale, reluctant sun. Across the low, rolling hills of Scandinavia, shadows stretched long over the earth. In the stillness, the land seemed to hold its breath. Here and there, beneath the frost and the whisper of winter wind, rose the mounds, ancient humps of earth, some crowned with stones, others softened by centuries of grass and moss. They were older than memory, older than the oldest living skald's tale. In some places they stood in silent rows, like the spine of a sleeping dragon buried beneath the soil. In others, they loomed solitary and proud, guarding the headlands, watching the fjords. The people who lived nearby did not speak of them lightly. They did not linger near them after sunset, for in the eyes of the Norse, these were not simply graves. They were gates, gates between the worlds. Even the boldest raider, a man who had faced steel and fire on distant shores, would pause when his path led past such a mound. His stride might slow, his gaze flicker away. Some would make a small gesture, a hand brushing an amulet, a whispered word to the gods as if to remind the spirits within that they meant no harm. The wind here carried a different weight. It hissed through the bent grass like the whisper of voices too old to name. Ravens perched on the weathered stones that marked some mounds, their black eyes glistening in the thin light, as if they were sentinels of the dead. Travelers said you could feel it if you stopped and listened to presence in the earth. Not the presence of decay, but of watchfulness, a sense that someone or something was aware of you, that it could see you even if you could not see it. These mounds marked the resting places of Viking chieftains, shield maidens, traders, and heroes people whose names were once sung in the mead halls, now long swallowed by time. Beneath the soil lay their bones, their weapons, and the treasures they would carry into the afterlife. Some lay within wooden chambers, their final bed lined with furs. Others rested in entire ships, their prows still aimed at the horizon, as if ready to sail into eternity. And yet, for centuries, these graves lay untouched. The treasures buried within them, gold arm rings, jeweled sword hilts, silver bowls from the east, could have bought a man more land than his grandchildren could ever farm. Yet no one dared dig. No one thought themselves clever enough to steal from the dead and walk away unscathed. It was not ignorance of what lay beneath. Everyone knew. The stories were told often enough by firelight of the great ships buried whole, of the warriors resting with their spears still in hand, of the queens who went to their graves surrounded by silks, brooches, and carved chests. But these were stories told with a certain tone, the tone one uses for dangerous truths. The people of the North lived close to death. They were raiders, hunters, and farmers in a hard land where each winter could take the week. They did not fear death in the way that strangers from the South might, but they did respect it, and they respected the invisible rules that bound the living to the dead. Every mound was a pact. The dead had been sent properly on their way, with rites and offerings to guide their souls into the next world. In return, they were to rest in peace. The living would not trouble them. The land would not be plowed here. Fires would not be lit upon these hills. Break that pact, and the stories said you would meet a fate worse than death. At night, the mounds seemed to shift in the moonlight, their slopes gleaming pale against the black earth. Travelers whispered of strange lights that flickered above them, cold, bluish flames that danced without warmth. Some said these were the spirits of the dead, wandering for a moment from their earthen halls. Others claimed they were warnings, signs that the mound did not wish to be approached. And then there were the voices. Farmers working near certain mounds swore they heard them faint at first, like the wind through the reeds, then growing clearer until they became words in the old tongue. Sometimes it was laughter, other times a low, mournful chant. Always, it was enough to make a man walk away, leaving his work unfinished. The skalds told of restless warriors called draugar mound dwellers who could rise in a form half shadow, half solid, to defend their grave goods. They could crush a man's bones with their hands or drive him mad with their gaze. Against such things, no sword was of use, and so the mounds endured. The Norse would pass them by in silence, acknowledging their presence without trespass. Even the children were taught never climb them, never disturb the stones, never dig there, no matter what you think you'll find. The result was that, for hundreds of years, these burial sites remained as they had been on the day of the funeral, the dead still wrapped in their cloaks, their swords still in their grasp, their gold still gleaming in the dark. Only in the last few centuries would daring or foolhardy hands disturb these places, and when they did, what they found confirmed the truth of the old tales. These were not mere graves. They were the frozen echoes of an age when death itself was a power to be reckoned with, and the dead were still watching. In the world of the Vikings, death was not an end, but a crossing a voyage from one shore to another, and like all voyages, it required preparation, guidance, and the blessing of the gods. To die without such rites was to risk wandering forever, lost between worlds, neither among the living nor welcomed into the halls of the dead. This belief was as much a part of Norse life as the changing of the seasons. From the moment of death, the living entered into a sacred duty to see the departed safely on their way. The correct rituals had to be observed, the right words spoken, the proper offerings given. A funeral was not merely the marking of a loss, it was the sealing of a pact between the living and the dead, one as binding as any oath sworn before the gods. This pact was understood without needing to be written. It was the way of things, as old as the first mounds that rose from the northern earth. The pact held two promises. The first, that the living would honor the dead, remember their names in story and song, and guard their resting place against insult or harm. The second, that the dead, in turn, would remain in their proper realm, watching over their descendants and protecting the clan's fortunes, but never crossing the boundary back to the world of the living without cause. In this way, the dead remained part of the community, invisible, yet present, woven into the fate of the family. The Norse were a practical people. They built ships to master the sea, tilled poor soil to wrest food from it, fought wars for honor and wealth. But in matters of death, they were also deeply reverent and wary. A burial mound was not a place for idle wandering. It was the dwelling of a spirit, one who might still hold sway over the health, safety, and prosperity of the clan. Disturbing such a place was more than robbery. It was a violation of the oldest law of kinship. It was breaking the boundary between worlds. The sagas tell of those who dared break this pact, and the price they paid. One such tale speaks of Eorleif, a man driven by greed. He had heard of the silver buried with a chieftain who had been laid to rest generations before. Under a moonless sky, he dug into the mound until his hands struck wood. Inside, he found wealth coins from distant lands, gold arm rings, a sword with a hilt bound in silver wire. But as he pried the last ring from the skeletal wrist of the dead chieftain, the corpse's eyes opened. There was no sound, no cry of warning, only the unbearable weight of that gaze. Orleif stumbled from the mound with his hair turned white as fresh snow. Within 3 days he was dead, his body wasted, and his spirit broken. The old people shook their heads and said he had met the Vernd, the vengeance of the grave. Such stories were not told merely to frighten. They were warnings, reminders that the pact was not to be taken lightly. But superstition was not the only thing that upheld it. Even when later kings and Christian priests began to write down the old laws, the crime of grave robbing remained one of the most serious. A man who stole cattle might be fined. A man who took a neighbor's timber could be forced to repay twice its worth. But a man who stole from a grave could be declared utlager, an outlaw. To be outlawed was to be cut off from all protection. No one was bound to give you food or shelter. Anyone might kill you without consequence. You became a walking ghost, a man alive in the flesh, but dead in every way that mattered. In the eyes of your people, you had placed yourself outside the circle of the living, just as surely as if you had crossed into the land of the dead and tried to return. It was the living world's echo of the draugar's fate, a restless being, neither here nor there. Outlawry was rare, but its shadow was enough to keep most from even considering the desecration of a mound. The pact between the living and the dead bound not just families, but entire communities. A burial site was not merely private property, it was sacred ground, a place where the realms of Midgard and the afterlife touched, and such places demanded respect. This was not only a matter of fear, there was also honor in keeping the pact. Even in years of hunger, when the soil of the mound might have been rich and undisturbed, no farmer would drive his plow through it. When a hall needed strong beams for its roof, the timbers of an old burial chamber were left to rot where they lay. When firewood grew scarce in winter, the posts of a grave's stone setting were never burned. It was not worth the risk, not the wrath of the gods, nor the wrath of the spirit buried beneath. For many, the dead were not only to be avoided, but to be tended to. Some believed that the buried could still see and hear from their mounds, and that their goodwill could be won with offerings. In some places, the living would leave food, drink, or small gifts on the mound during the great seasonal festivals, especially at Yule, the midwinter feast. This was a way of saying, "We have not forgotten you, and we have kept the pact." It was said that when a clan was in danger, when famine loomed, or when enemies threatened, the spirit of an honored ancestor might stir beneath the earth. Such spirits could bring fortune to their kin, or disaster to their enemies, turning the tide of war, or filling the larder against all odds. To have such an ancestor was a source of great pride, but it was also a responsibility. The living had to honor their side of the pact to receive such aid. Thus, the burial mound was at once tomb and fortress, shrine and prison. It was a place of memory, of honor, and of power. The contract between the living and the dead ensured that these earthen halls would remain sealed for generations, their treasures untouched, their guardians undisturbed. This is why, for centuries, no matter how poor a man became, no matter how tempting the thought of silver and gold hidden beneath the earth, the pact held. The mounds stood in silence, watching over the land, and the people passed them by without trespass. It was not fear alone that kept them intact. It was something older, something deeper, a bond between the worlds that no man of sense would dare to break. To the Vikings, death was not a single destination, but a branching road. When a man or woman took their last breath, their soul did not vanish. It traveled, and where it went depended on how they had lived, how they had died, and whether the proper rites had been carried out. The afterlife was not a single hall or heaven, but a vast, intricate map of realms, each with its own ruler, its own purpose, and its own laws. The most famous of these realms was Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. It was the place of warriors chosen by Odin himself, the All-Father, those who had died with weapon in hand, who had met death bravely in battle, might find themselves riding into Valhalla's golden gates. There they would feast on the meat of the ever-renewing boar Sahrimnir, drink endless horns of mead served by Valkyries, and train each day for the final battle at Ragnarok. For such men, burial rites were not just tradition, they were a warrior's final muster into Odin's host. But Valhalla was not the only warrior's paradise. Freyja, goddess of love and war, ruled Folkvanger, a meadowed realm where she claimed half of the worthy battle-o-dead for her own hall, Sessrumnir. To be taken, there was no dishonor. Indeed, many believed Freyja's hall was gentler, more beautiful, and perhaps even more desirable than Odin's great hall. For those who did not die in battle, the journey might lead to hell, not the Christian hell, but a vast, cold realm in Niflheim, ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. This was the resting place of those who died of sickness, old age, or misfortune, and it was not a place of torment, but one of shadow and stillness. There, the dead dwelt in halls of frost and stone, their days quiet, their memory fading in the living world, unless their kin kept their names alive. There were other paths still. Sailors lost at sea might be welcomed into the hall of Ran, the sea goddess, who gathered drowned men into her net and kept them in her deep halls beneath the waves. Hunters and travelers who died far from home might find themselves wandering the spirit-haunted wilds of the Uttafor, caught between the realms. And for those of great dishonor, oath-breakers, kinslayers, and cowards, darker fates awaited, though the sagas speak of these places in whispers more than clear description. Because the Norse afterlife was so varied, the funeral was not a simple farewell. It was a setting of the course, the choosing of which road the soul would take. A man who had died as a warrior might be buried with his weapons and shield, his body arranged as though ready to rise and fight again. A seafarer might be laid in a ship, its prow pointing toward the horizon, as though he would sail into the next world. A woman of high standing might be surrounded by her finest jewelry, her keys symbols of household authority, and perhaps even servants or companions. Their lives ended to follow her into death. The dead were given grave goods not only for comfort and status, but because the journey to the afterlife was thought to be as real and as demanding as any voyage in the living world. A man might need silver to pay passage, a sword to defend himself, a cloak against the cold winds of the Shadowlands. These items were placed with care, often after elaborate rituals involving song, sacrifice, and the recitation of the dead person's deeds. Disturbing such a burial was not just theft, it was sabotaging the soul's voyage. If the sword was taken, how could the warrior defend himself on the road to Valhalla? If the silver was stolen, how could he pay his way across the rivers and passes of the otherworld? To rob a grave was to risk condemning a kinsman or even a stranger to wander forever, restless and incomplete. In the eyes of the living, such an act was not only a crime against the dead, but an affront to the gods themselves. The sagas tell of spirits who lingered because something had gone wrong with their journey. A sword stolen, a burial botched, the rites performed incorrectly, all could bind a soul to the mound. Such a spirit could become a draugar, neither fully alive nor at peace, bound to guard the treasures and the remains of their former life. These beings were feared above all, for they were driven not by blind rage, but by the cold, implacable will of one who had been denied rest. This is why burial mounds were treated with such reverence. They were not inert piles of earth. They were sealed gateways, portals, through which a soul had passed into its destined realm. To break into such a place was to force the gate open again, to tamper with a journey already underway. The consequences, everyone knew, would be dire. Even centuries later, when Christianity began to take root in Scandinavia and the old gods were pushed aside, many of these beliefs endured. Churchmen could preach about heaven and hell, but in the deep countryside, people still spoke of Valhalla, Folkvanger, and Helheim. They still left offerings at the mounds, still avoided speaking ill of the dead, still feared the vengeance of a restless spirit. Thus, the Viking vision of the afterlife was not merely a matter of faith, it was a living force in their culture, shaping how they treated their dead and why they guarded their graves so fiercely. The mounds stood as more than memorials. They were the very doors to worlds unseen. To disturb them was not only to dishonor the past, but to risk unraveling the invisible threads between the living and the dead. And so the mounds remained untouched. The dead slept on, their treasures intact, their journeys unbroken, their paths into the next world sealed. The living walked past in silence, casting a glance toward the low humps in the earth, reminded of the roads that all must one day walk, and of the wisdom in letting those who had already gone travel in peace. In the Viking world, the law was not simply a set of rules. It was the invisible spine of society, the structure that held together a people who lived in a land without kings in every valley, and without standing armies to enforce order. Honor, oath, and law were the three pillars of life, and to break one was to risk losing all. Grave robbing was not merely theft in this world. It was among the most heinous crimes a man could commit. The ancient Norse believed that disturbing the dead endangered not only the soul of the thief, but the well-being of the entire community. The law treated it accordingly. In the early medieval period, much of Scandinavian law was not written but spoken. The lögsugumaður, the law speaker, would stand before the assembled Shing, the open-air assembly of free men, and recite the laws from memory. Every year, these words were spoken aloud, so that no one could claim ignorance. Among these oral laws was the grim judgment for those who defiled a grave. The punishment was utlegð, exile, what we now call outlawry. To be declared utlegð was not simply to be banished. It was to be stripped of your humanity in the eyes of the law. You became, in a legal sense, dead. Once outlawed, you had no protection under the law. If you were injured or killed, there was no compensation owed to your kin. If you sought shelter, any who gave it risked sharing your fate. You could not speak at the singing, could not inherit property, could not trade openly. You were cut adrift from the web of rights and obligations that bound the Norse world together. There were two kinds of outlawry. Skogangri, the going into the forest, was full outlawry, permanent, and without hope of return. It meant you had to leave your land, your family, your home forever. The forest was both literal and symbolic, the uninhabited wilderness, where no law held sway. There, wolves would be your only companions, hunger your daily companion, and every human you met, a potential hunter. The other was Furbolgsgarður, the three circles banishment, a lesser form of outlawry that lasted 3 years. A man given this sentence could, in theory, return if he survived his exile. But for many, exile meant slow death, starvation, cold, or the sword of an opportunistic enemy. For the crime of grave robbing, the seeing could and often did decree skogangri. It was considered worse than slaying a man in open combat. Murder, at least, could sometimes be settled with wergild, the man price a payment to the victim's family, but the violation of a burial was an insult to the dead themselves, who could not be compensated. It was an act that offended gods, kin, and spirits alike. Stories from the sagas tell of such judgments. In one tale from the Losvetninga saga, a man named Geitir was accused of robbing the burial mound of a neighboring chieftain. Witnesses swore they saw him with silver arm rings matching those buried with the dead man. At the sing, the law speaker recited the ancient penalty. Let him be utlag, his life forfeit, his name unspoken among us. Geitir fled into the highlands. For months, hunters pursued him like an animal. He was found in the early winter, frozen to the ground where he had fallen asleep. The saga says no cairn was raised over him, for no one would risk honoring a man who had defiled the honored dead. The fear of such a fate was powerful. In a culture where a man's worth was measured in honor, being cast out made less than a man was a punishment worse than death. Death at least could be faced with courage, your deeds remembered in song. Outlawry erased your place in the story. You vanished from the memory of your people, condemned to wander unseen in both life and death. Even in the harsh Viking world, law was a delicate balance between justice and survival. A man might forgive theft of food in a harsh winter. He might even forgive a killing if wergild was paid. But to desecrate a burial site, to break the contract between the living and the dead, was an offense that could not be mended. The community's answer was absolute removal. You did not belong among the living. It is this severity, coupled with the deep spiritual fear of the dead's vengeance, that kept the mounds untouched for centuries. No treasure, no matter how bright, could outweigh the certainty of ruin that came from such a crime. The law did not merely threaten the grave robber with punishment, it marked him as already lost. In the eyes of the Norse, to rob a grave was to put yourself beyond the circle of protection and fellowship. The outlaw became a ghost among the living, hunted until he vanished into the wilderness, his body unburied, his spirit forever wandering. Thus the legal and the spiritual worked hand in hand. The gods might curse you, the spirits might hunt you, and the Sing would strip you of the very identity that made you human. Between these three forces, divine wrath, ghostly vengeance, and human judgment, the sanctity of the Viking burial mound was preserved, not for years, but for ages. In Viking society, a burial mound was never just a resting place for the dead. It was a monument to lineage, a marker of territory, and a declaration of belonging. To the Norse, ancestry was not a matter of dusty records, but of living memory, carved into the very land itself, and the mound was the proof. Every freeborn man or woman in the North carried their ancestry like a shield. In a land without stone castles or endless written charters, family power was measured in names remembered, in tales told by the fire, and in the visible signs that one's kin had held this ground for generations. Burial mounds were those signs. A row of them along a ridge, or a single great mound on a headland, spoke louder than any parchment. This land is ours. Our blood sleeps beneath it. These were not abstract claims. In disputes over farmland, fishing rights, or meadows, the presence of ancestral graves could tip the balance in a clan's favor. The mounds were evidence of ancient occupancy, far more convincing than the word of a man with no such markers to show. They were also spiritual fortresses, a statement that the ancestors themselves stood watch over the land, lending their invisible strength to its living heirs. The sagas give us glimpses of this truth. In Eyrbyggja saga, the chieftain Thorolf Mostraskegg builds his hall within sight of his ancestors' burial site, so that the dead may look upon the fields and know they are well kept. This was not mere sentiment. It was a way of anchoring one's authority to the land through the unbroken chain of generations. To destroy such a mound was to strike at the very roots of a family's claim, an act tantamount to war, and war is exactly what it could bring. In the fierce clan politics of the Viking Age, no insult was greater than the violation of an ancestral grave. The dishonor was double, first to the memory of the dead, and second to the standing of the living. The wrong demanded blood to right it. In such a world, disturbing a mound was not only spiritually dangerous but physically suicidal. There was another layer to this bond between burial and land. Inheritance, Viking law complex, oral, and fiercely defended, often tied rights of ownership to one's proven connection to a place. A man who could point to the mounds of his forebears as proof of settlement stood on firmer ground at the singing than one who could not. The burial mound thus became a physical argument in any dispute, its very existence, a silent witness in the court of the open air. These markers also shaped how land was passed down. In many cases, a farm or homestead was more than just soil and timber. It was the seat of a bloodline. To sell it away or abandon it was to sever that bloodline's tie to its ancestors. The burial mound stood as a constant reminder of the responsibility to keep the land in the family, to farm it, defend it, and hand it to one's children. Because the mounds carried such weight, their placement was deliberate. They were often built on ridges or high ground where they could be seen from far off, looming, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. In coastal areas, They were raised where approaching ships could see them, sending a message across the water. This shore is watched. These fields are claimed. The people here are not rootless wanderers, but the heirs of those who came before. The protection this afforded was not merely symbolic. In a world where disputes over grazing land, fishing rights, or boundaries could escalate quickly, the visible presence of a family's burial mounds could dissuade encroachment. To trespass here was to challenge not only the living occupants but the weight of all their forefathers. Archaeology has confirmed the enduring nature of these sites. In many Scandinavian farmsteads, burial mounds have stood for over 1,000 years, their outlines still visible, even when the names of those beneath are long forgotten. Excavations show that generations sometimes added to existing mounds or built new ones nearby, reinforcing the statement of ownership through the centuries. There was also a belief, half legally, half spiritual, that the ancestors could defend their land. If wronged, they might bring misfortune on those who trespassed, whether by guiding the living kin in battle or by sending more mysterious forms of harm, sickness, bad harvests, strange accidents. The land itself was thought to be under their protection, woven into the pact between the living and the dead. Because of this, to damage or rob a mound was not only to invite legal punishment and clan vengeance, it was to risk supernatural retaliation. And this was retaliation with no statute of limitations. The dead could wait. This is why even in times of famine, when desperate men might be tempted to dig for valuables, most would not touch a mound that tied a family to its home. The risk was too great. To be seen as one who had violated such a grave was to be branded a landwith thief and an oath-breaker, a man with no honor and no claim anywhere. The burial mound thus stood at the crossroads of memory, law, and territory. It was a gravestone, a legal charter, and a war standard all in one. It told every traveler, "We were here before you, and we will be here after you." It reminded every kinsman, "You are bound to this place by blood and by oath." And it warned every rival, "The land has eyes. The dead are watching." For the Vikings, to erase such a monument was to erase a bloodline from the map of the living, and that was a crime no one mortal or divine would easily forgive. In the sagas and fireside tales of the North, the dead did not always sleep quietly beneath their mounds. Some were said to stir, some to rise, and some to walk among the living, not as pale shadows or harmless whispers, but as powerful, solid, dangerous beings, the dreaded draugar. To the Vikings, the draugar was the ultimate guardian of the grave. These were not ghostly phantoms that faded with daylight. They were the corpse of the dead man himself, animated by a relentless will, stronger and more fearsome than in life. The mound dweller was not merely there to haunt, but to protect. His task was simple: guard his treasures, his weapons, and the sanctity of his burial from all who would dare disturb it. The appearance of a draugar was said to be unmistakable. The skin was corpse pale, or sometimes black as night, stretched tight over a frame that seemed swollen with unnatural strength. The eyes burned, not like a living man's, but like coals in a dying fire. The smell of the grave clung to him, a stench that could sicken the strongest warrior, and though dead, the draugar was heavy, impossibly heavy, as if the weight of the earth itself was in his limbs. Legends say that the draugar possessed many powers. They could grow to an enormous size in battle, crush a man with their bare hands, or fling him far across the field. They could walk through stone, slip into dreams to torment the living, or cloak themselves in darkness so that they seemed to vanish in plain sight. Some could control the weather around their mounds, summoning sudden storms to drive away intruders. But their greatest weapon was fear. To see one rise from the mound was to feel the soul-deep knowledge that you had crossed a line that should never be crossed. Even the bravest warriors, those who had faced steel and fire without flinching, often broke before the relentless, silent wrath of a draugar. The sagas are full of encounters with these guardians. In Grettis' saga Asmundar Sonar, the hero Grettir challenges Kar the Old, a mound dweller whose grave held a sword of great value. When Grettir opens the mound, Kar rises to meet him. They wrestle in the half-darkness of the burial chamber, the dead man's strength nearly overwhelming the living hero. Only by cunning and sheer will does Grettir prevail, and even then, the victory is tinged with dread. He has won the sword, but at what cost? In other tales, the draugar does not wait for intrusion. If it senses that its grave has been threatened, it may leave its mound under the cover of night to exact vengeance. Farmers tell of waking to find their livestock dead, their doors torn from hinges, their fires cold and smothered with earth. In some stories, the draugar sits astride the chest of the offender while he sleeps, crushing the breath from his lungs until he wakes in terror, if he wakes at all. The presence of a draugar was not always born of malice. In many traditions, it was believed that a man became a mound dweller because something bound him to the world: greed for the treasures buried with him, an unfulfilled oath, a deep loyalty to his kin, or a grudge against a living rival. In such cases, the spirit's return was inevitable, and disturbing the grave would only awaken it sooner. There were ways, it was said, to guard against them, or to destroy them. A body suspected of becoming a draugar might be bound with iron bands before burial, or pierced through with stakes to pin it to the earth. In extreme cases, the head might be severed and placed between the legs, or the body burned entirely. These were grim measures, taken not out of cruelty but necessity, for a draugar was almost impossible to kill once risen. For those who had no choice but to face a mound dweller, there were rules to the battle. The fight had to be finished in the grave itself. Driving the draugar away was useless, for it would return. Weapons of iron were said to bite deepest, but strength of will mattered as much as steel. One had to face the guardian without faltering. For the moment fear took hold, the fight was lost. Yet few dared even attempt such a thing. The draugar was more than a monster. It was the living embodiment of the pact between the living and the dead. Its very existence reminded the living why they left the mounds alone. If the dead could rise to defend their rest, then it was better not to give them reason to. And the draugar was not the only guardian spoken of in the north. Some mounds were said to be protected by the landvater, the spirits of the land, or by ancestral shades who could appear as animals, birds, or even sudden, unnatural winds. These beings did not grapple like the draugar, but their warnings were unmistakable. A sudden flock of ravens rising from a mound at your approach, a fox staring too long from the grass, a wind that whispers your name, though no one else is near. Whether through the sheer terror of the draugar or the subtler signs of the landvater, the message was always the same. The mounds are watched. The dead are not abandoned. It was this belief that any mound might hold a guardian willing to defend it that gave Viking burial grounds their eerie, untouchable aura. For centuries it kept grave robbers away, protected the treasures and memories within, and ensured that the pact between the living and the dead was never broken lightly. Long before the first Christian cross rose over Scandinavia, the people of the north believed that the land itself was alive, not simply in the obvious sense of wind and water, trees and animals, but in a deeper, older way. Every valley, every headland, every stone-strewn field was home to unseen beings, the landvater, the spirits of the land. These spirits were not the souls of the dead, though they often dwelled near human settlements and burial sites. They were older, more primal, bound to the land as tightly as roots to soil. Some were protectors of a farmstead, others of a meadow, a forest, or even an entire district. To live in a place was to live under their gaze, and to prosper there was to win their favor. The Landvatter could be as varied as the land itself. Some appeared in human form, tall and grave-faced, robed in green, or clad in hides. Others took the shapes of animals: a fox, a great white bear, a soaring eagle, a serpent, as long as a ship's mast. They could be beautiful and terrible in equal measure, the embodiment of the land's bounty and its dangers. Burial grounds were thought to be among the places most strongly guarded by the Landvatter. The dead were part of the land now, their bones mingled with its soil, their spirits woven into its memory. To disturb their rest was to strike at the very heart of the Landvatter's domain, and the spirits did not take such insults lightly. The sagas tell of travelers who ignored local warnings and camped upon sacred ground, only to be driven away by uncanny events. A sudden storm would roar over a calm night, snapping tent poles and drenching the fire. Horses would rear and bolt as if fleeing an unseen predator. Food would spoil overnight, turning rancid before morning. Some men awoke to find themselves lost, the familiar landscape somehow strange and unrecognizable, as if the land itself had shifted to drive them out. The Icelandic law code, the draugas, reflects this deep respect for the Landvatter. Ships entering Iceland were required to lower their carved figureheads before approaching land, lest the fearsome shapes offend the spirits watching from shore. This was not mere superstition, but a matter of law, a recognition that harmony with the Landvatter was as important as peace with one's neighbors. On farms, offerings were sometimes made to these spirits, especially at the turning of the seasons. A splash of ale poured onto the earth, a portion of meat left in a grove, a handful of grain scattered in the field, small gifts to keep the spirits friendly. Some families placed carved stones or small shrines at the edge of their property, marking the invisible boundary between their own work and the wild domain of the Landvatter. It was said that those who honored the spirits would be rewarded with fertile fields, healthy livestock, and protection from harm. But those who angered them might find their wells gone dry, their crops failing, their animals sickening without cause. And few acts were thought to anger the Landvatter more than disturbing a burial mound. A mound was a meeting place of powers, the memory of the ancestors, the presence of the dead, and the deep, ancient awareness of the land itself. In some traditions, the mound was even thought to be the dwelling place of the Landvatter, or a doorway through which they could pass into the world of men. To dig into it was to break into their home. One tale from the Njordr saga Heriðu tells of a farmer who, seeking stones for a new hall, dismantled part of an old mound on his land. Not long after, his cattle began to vanish, his crops withered, and his children fell ill. The neighbors whispered that the Landvatter had turned against him. When at last he rebuilt the mound, restoring it as best he could, the misfortunes ceased, but his family never recovered its former prosperity. The fear of such consequences kept the mounds safe for centuries. Even those bold enough to risk the wrath of a draugar often hesitated before testing the anger of the Landvatter. The dead could be fought, perhaps even defeated, but who could fight the land itself? It was not uncommon for people traveling through unfamiliar country to make a small offering when they passed a conspicuous mound, especially one that stood alone on a hilltop or in a clearing. A coin, a carved bead, even a few whispered words of greeting, all were ways of saying, "I acknowledge you. I mean no harm." Some carried charms to protect against the Landvatter's displeasure, often carved with runes for peace and safe passage. Over time, as Christianity spread and the old beliefs were pushed to the margins, the formal worship of the Landvatter faded, but the respect remained. Farmers still avoided plowing over certain mounds. Builders still chose to place their halls just far enough from these ancient earthworks to give the spirits room. And in the quiet of a long northern twilight, some still claimed to see a figure watching from the mound's crest, neither man nor beast, but something older and waiting. In this way, the Landvatir became not only the protectors of the land, but the unseen sentinels of its memory. They ensured that burial grounds and the treasures and stories they held remained undisturbed. And so the pact was kept between the living, the dead, and the spirits who bound them to the earth they all called home. In the Viking Age, a grave was often more than earth and stone, it was a message. The mound itself spoke through its size and placement, declaring the power of the one who lay beneath. But some burials went further. They carried carved warnings in the oldest language of the North, the runes. These were no polite epitaphs. They were threats, binding curses meant to chill the blood of any who might dare disturb the mound. Runes were far more than an alphabet to the Norse. They were symbols of power, each one tied to forces older than the gods themselves. To carve a rune was to make a mark, not just on wood or stone, but on reality. The right combination could bless a ship for fair sailing, shield a warrior in battle, or ward a home against fire. And in the hands of one skilled in the runes, they could bind a curse to a place or object so deeply that it would endure for centuries. Some Viking grave markers bear inscriptions that seem, to our modern eyes, almost like legal warnings. One Swedish stone reads, "May he be doomed who breaks this monument." Another warns, "A curse on him who disturbs this grave." These are not poetic flourishes, they are deliberate protections, invoking powers both divine and chthonic to avenge any desecration. In many cases, the runes did not simply threaten vague misfortune, they promised specific punishments: blindness, madness, the wasting of the body. In one example from Denmark, a stone is carved with the runes for Nithingr, villain, or honorless one, branding any future violator with the worst insult in the Viking lexicon. To be named Nithingr was to be cut off from all fellowship, to be a living outcast. The effectiveness of such curses lay not only in the fear of supernatural punishment, but in the social weight of the words themselves. A curse made public on stone was a declaration to all who passed that the dead beneath were defended not only by kin and clan, but by powers no man could see. Even those who doubted the magic might still fear the shame, for the runes proclaimed that the violator's name would live on in infamy. Archaeological finds suggest that some runic curses were not merely warnings to strangers, but aimed at specific rivals. On certain stones, the phrasing shifts from general threats to personal accusations, naming those who might dare disturb the grave, and cursing them by name. In such cases, the inscription was both magical defense and political weapon, a way of ensuring that enemies would think twice before striking at the honor of the dead. Runic protection did not always appear on upright stones. In some cases, the runes were carved into the very timbers of the burial chamber, or scratched into grave goods themselves. These hidden inscriptions may have been meant for the eyes of the spirits alone, a reminder to the dead of their own strength, and an invitation to rise if their rest was violated. The sagas preserve glimpses of how seriously such curses were taken. In Erbygja saga, a dispute over a burial site ends with one man placing a carved post at the mound's entrance, marked with runes. Soon after, his rival falls ill with a strange wasting sickness. The storyteller leaves the cause unspoken, but the implication is clear. In Grettis saga, the hero warns that to enter a mound without proper rites is to invite the runes to judge you. No one listening in a smoky longhouse would have doubted what that meant. To the Norse mind, runic magic was binding because it was written in the language of the unseen. A curse carved in runes was not a mere wish. It was a contract with the forces it invoked. Break the grave, and those forces would come for you. This belief was so strong that even centuries later, when Christianity had taken root, medieval Scandinavians still scratched protective marks on churchyard gates and gravestones. The faith had changed, but the fear of the carved curse endured. Some historians argue that the runic grave curse was as much about psychology as magic. The knowledge that such a curse existed might be enough to cause real harm, sleepless nights, gnawing guilt, a creeping sense of being watched. In a world where illness could strike without warning, any misfortune after touching a cursed grave would be seen as proof of the rune's power. For the Viking grave robber, rare though he was, these curses were an additional barrier. Even if he did not believe in spirits, he would know that kin of the dead might use the runes as justification for vengeance. A man marked by a curse was a man marked for death. The social and magical consequences blurred together until they were one and the same. The runes on a grave were not only about keeping the dead in peace, they were about keeping the living in fear, and they worked. Graves with such inscriptions, when excavated in modern times, are often found untouched, their treasures still lying where they were placed 1,000 years before. Whether by magic, by threat, or by the simple chill that comes from reading words of death carved in the old tongue, the protection held. Thus, the runeo-cursed graves stood as silent sentinels among the burial mounds. They did not shout their warning. They whispered it in the language of the earth and the gods, in the shapes of ancient lines cut deep into stone. And for centuries, that whisper was enough to keep the living at bay. Beneath the soft mounds of earth, under layers of soil and centuries of silence, the Vikings laid their dead to rest, with riches that could rival the hoards of kings. Yet for generation after generation, those treasures remained where they had been placed undisturbed, unseen by human eyes, save for the flicker of torchlight on the day of burial. These were not mere trinkets. The graves of chieftains and warriors could hold wealth that would change the fate of any living man. Golden arm rings thick as a child's wrist, silver cups from the Frankish courts, carved ivory from the far north, silk from the markets of Byzantium. In some burials, whole chests of coins lay beside the dead, gold and silver stamped with the faces of emperors who had never heard the name of the man who now kept them in death. And then there were the weapons. Swords forged with pattern-welded steel, their rippling blades gleaming even in the half-light light of the grave. Axes with inlaid silver on the haft. Spears with leaf-shaped heads that could pierce mail as if it were linen. Shields painted with the colors of a man's kin. To the living, these were tools of war and symbols of honor. To the dead, they were the means of defending themselves on their journey to the afterlife. But the most awe-inspiring grave goods were the ships. Some were small fishing vessels, others great warships, drawn up from the water and set into a pit, the body of the dead placed within. Around them were laid oars, anchors, and sails, so that the voyage into the next world might be as swift as any raid across the sea. These burials were colossal undertakings, requiring hundreds of hours of labor and the resources of an entire community. Why bury such wealth? To the Norse, the answer was simple. The dead needed it. The journey after death was long and uncertain, and the soul might require all the tools, food, and riches it had enjoyed in life. The idea of stripping a man of his goods before burial would have seemed as shameful as abandoning a kinsman on the battlefield without his sword. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, uncovered in the early 20th century, gives us a glimpse of this tradition at its height. Within the ship lay 2 women of high rank, their identities still debated by historians. With them were placed carved sleighs, finely woven tapestries, imported silks, and richly adorned wagons. There were buckets of apples, beds with down-filled pillows, and even intricately carved animal head posts whose purpose remains a mystery. Any single one of these objects could have been sold for a fortune, yet they had been left in the earth for over 1,000 years. The Gokstad ship burial tells a similar story. A chieftain rested there, surrounded by 3 smaller boats, a tent, 12 horses, and a feast's worth of food. Around him were placed gaming boards, cloaks of fine cloth, and weapons fit for a king. It was a hoard beyond the dreams of most living men, yet none touched it until modern archaeologists uncovered it in 1880. For the poor farmer or struggling craftsman, The knowledge that such treasures lay within arm's reach must have been a cruel temptation. But in the Viking world, temptation was always measured against the cost. To steal from the dead was to risk not only outlawry and death at the hands of the living, but the vengeance of the draugar and the curse of the landvatter. The runes carved on stones made the warning plain, and the stories told by the fire made it vivid. Even so, there were whispers of those who tried. In some excavations, archaeologists have found signs that a grave was entered long ago, but rarely do these seem to have been full robberies. More often, only a single object was taken, perhaps as a token or a relic, leaving the rest untouched. It is as if even the boldest thief could not bring himself to fully break the pact. And there were other reasons the treasures remained undisturbed. In many cases, the graves lay in places difficult to reach, on remote hilltops, in isolated valleys, or on small islands. The effort of transporting heavy goods from such places was considerable, and the risk of being caught along the way was high. More than one story tells of would-be thieves who vanished before they could return home with their prize, their disappearance blamed on the wrath of the dead. There was also the matter of ownership. Everyone in a community knew whose ancestors lay in which mounds. To rob such a grave was to invite direct, bloody reprisal from the kin of the dead. In a culture where family honor could be defended with an axe, this alone was enough to keep most men's hands clean. So the treasures stayed in their earthen halls. The ships rotted slowly in their pits. The silver tarnished, the gold dulled. The weapons, once bright and deadly, lay wrapped in the embrace of rust. But the value of these things to the dead, and the fear they inspired in the living, preserved them for centuries. It was not until the modern age, when the belief in the draugar had faded, and the law no longer punished grave robbers with exile or death, that these mounds were opened in earnest. And when they were, the archaeologists who entered them found the truth of the old tales. The treasures were real, and they were magnificent. Yet even now, standing before the glass cases in a museum where the gold and silver of the Vikings gleam under artificial light, one can almost feel the weight of the past. These things were meant for the hands of the dead, not the eyes of the living. And somewhere, in the quiet places of the north, there are still mounds that no spade has touched, where treasures lie waiting in the dark, guarded by silence, by memory, and perhaps by something more. In the Viking Age, death was never only a private matter. The burial of a chieftain, warrior, or wealthy landowner was as much a public performance as it was a farewell. It was a final act of power, a message carved into the landscape, meant to speak long after the last mourner had gone home. The funeral itself was a spectacle. A high-born man's burial could last for days, with feasting, drinking, the recitation of sagas, and the exchange of gifts. These were not simply acts of mourning, they were acts of politics. Every horn of mead raised was a reminder of the dead man's wealth. Every gift given was a thread binding the living more tightly to the house of the deceased. The funeral bound the community together under the shadow of the loss, but it also reinforced the authority of those who inherited the dead man's position. The mound that followed was the lasting seal on this display. Its size, placement, and construction were deliberate choices, designed to project status to friend and foe alike. A great mound on a ridge above a fjord told sailors before they even made harbor that a man of consequence lay there and that his kin still watched the waters. A row of smaller mounds leading to a larger one spoke of generations of authority, each one anchored in the bones beneath. These monuments were visible not only to the local community but to passing traders, raiders, and rivals. The message was unmistakable. We have power. We have history. We are rooted in this land. In a time when leadership depended on personal prestige as much as formal authority, such visible reminders of a family's strength were crucial. Burial could also serve as a warning. A mound built large enough, with sufficient effort and wealth, was a declaration of the resources the family could command. If they could spare such riches for the dead, what might they do for the living? If they could mobilize dozens, even hundreds, to build a tomb, how many could they call to wield an axe in battle? In this way, the burial mound was a form of silent intimidation, a war standard raised in the earth itself. Some burials even incorporated the symbols of military might directly into their design. Ships placed in burial pits were not only a provision for the afterlife, they were also an emblem of the deceased's reach and capability. A ship meant trade, raiding, and the projection of force across the sea. To bury one was to remind all who saw it that the man in the mound had commanded fleets and that his heirs might do the same. In the sagas, such political use of death is clear. In Eyrbyggja saga, when Thorolf Mostrarskegg is buried, the mound is placed so it can be seen from the sea. It is not just a resting place, it is a marker of territory, a warning to any who might land uninvited. In Ynglinga saga, kings are buried in great mounds that become part of the identity of the land itself, so much so that later rulers use them as rallying points in times of crisis. The burial's location often reinforced this political purpose. Mounds were placed on borders to assert territorial claims, on high ground to dominate the horizon, or at crossroads to remind every traveler of the power that lay in the region. They were part of the political landscape as surely as a fortress or a chieftain's hall. The wealth placed in the grave was also a political statement. Grave goods spoke not only to the status of the dead, but to the generosity of the family. In Viking culture, generosity was a virtue expected of leaders. A stingy chieftain could not hold loyalty for long. By burying valuable goods with their dead, a family demonstrated that they had more than enough to share, even with the departed. It was a display of abundance meant to inspire loyalty among followers and envy among rivals. This political function of burial explains, in part, why graves were so rarely robbed. To disturb a mound was to challenge the authority of the family it represented. It was an act of defiance that demanded a response, often violent. And because these mounds were symbols of lineage, to destroy one was to attempt to erase the family from the map of history. Few were willing to invite such a feud. In this way, the burial mound was both shield and sword. It defended the memory of the dead and threatened those who might challenge the living. The same qualities that made it a political statement also made it an effective deterrent against trespass. Even centuries later, long after the person buried was forgotten, the mound retained its political weight. In rural communities, the presence of an ancient burial mound on a family's land could still lend a certain gravitas, a reminder, however faint, that their forebears had been people of importance. It tied them to the land in a way no simple deed of ownership could. Thus, the Viking burial mound served multiple purposes. It honored the dead, reinforced the authority of the living, marked territory, deterred rivals, and preserved the family's place in the web of alliances and feuds. It was a political tool as much as a cultural tradition, a statement written not in words but in the language of stone, soil, and spectacle. And so, long after the mourners had dispersed and the feasts were over, the mound remained an unblinking sentinel watching over the land, its message clear to all who passed. Here lies one of power. Here stands a family unbroken. To the Vikings, a hero did not end with death. The grave was not a wall between the living and the dead, but a doorway, and some believed the greatest among them could still step through. These were the Avahetur, the life heroes, whose courage, cunning, or sheer strength had been so great that even death could not diminish their presence in the world. The sagas speak often of such men and women. Their valor in life was matched by their influence in death. A warrior who had led men to victory might still lend his luck Haminga to his kin. A woman who had ruled a hall with wisdom and foresight might still guide her family's fortunes from beneath her mound. These ancestors were not passive shades, fading into the mist of memory. They were active guardians, protectors, and in some cases, avengers. This belief was not metaphor. The Norse meant it literally. A burial mound was not only a home for the dead, but a seat of power, a place from which a spirit could watch, listen, and act. Families would sometimes make offerings at the mound during times of trouble. A horn of ale poured into the soil, a loaf of fresh bread left on the grass, a whispered prayer for aid. And when fortune turned in their favor, they gave thanks to the one who rested there. The connection could run even deeper. It was said that a man might inherit not just land or wealth from his ancestor, but part of their filja, their personal spirit, and luck. This invisible gift could help him in battle, grant him foresight, or shield him from misfortune. But it had to be honored. Neglect the mound, forget the hero's name, and that protection could turn to indifference or even wrath. There are stories of warriors claiming to have fought with the strength of more than one man, because the spirit of a great forebear stood beside them in the shield wall. In Hervarar saga, Ok Hydrex, the heroine Hervor dares to call upon her dead father, the famed warrior Angantyr, demanding the cursed sword Tyrfing from his grave, and he answers, his voice rising from beneath the earth, reluctant but powerful. Though the tale is wrapped in poetry and myth, it reflects a belief rooted deep in Norse thought. The dead could hear, and they could answer. This undying presence could also take the form of warning. Some families told of dreams in which an ancestor appeared, speaking of dangers, yet unseen. A chieftain might be told to avoid a certain alliance. A farmer warned of an approaching storm. These dreams were taken seriously, not as superstition, but as counsel from someone who still had a stake in the family's fate. The influence of such heroes extended beyond the family. In times of conflict, their mounds could become rallying points. Before battle, warriors might gather around the grave of a legendary fighter, calling on his name for courage. This was more than symbolic. It was an attempt to draw the hero's luck into their own ranks. In a society where morale could decide the fate of a fight before the first sword was swung, the belief that an honored ancestor stood with you could be as potent as any weapon. But with this power came responsibility. The living were expected to keep the hero's memory alive, not just in the quiet of the family hall, but in public song and saga. Skalds would recite the deeds of the dead during feasts, their verses painting the hero's life in strokes of fire and blood. Each telling renewed the hero's place in the world, keeping the thread between mound and hall strong. Neglect, on the other hand, was dangerous. A mound left untended could signal to the hero's spirit that they were forgotten. In such cases, the tales say, the hero's luck might desert the family entirely. Crops would fail, herds would dwindle, and misfortune would seem to dog their steps. In the worst cases, the hero might return not as a guardian, but as a draugar, his love for his kin twisted into bitter rage at their neglect. It was not only kin who felt the hero's enduring presence. Strangers, too, might sense it when passing near the mound. Travelers spoke of a sudden stillness in the air, the hair on the neck rising as if under a watchful gaze. Some would leave small offerings even without knowing the hero's name, a gesture of respect to a power that still lingered. And so the mounds of heroes were treated with reverence bordering on fear. They were places where the boundary between worlds was thinnest, where a word spoken might be heard on both sides. No one with sense would disturb such a place not only because of law or custom, but because of the personal risk. To harm a mound was to harm the hero himself, and the retaliation could be swift, fierce, and inescapable. Even today, in the far reaches of Scandinavia, there are mounds that locals will not touch. Farmers plow around them, roads curve to avoid them. And if you ask why, the answer may be as simple as it is old, because someone important rests there, and he still watches over us. The undying presence of heroes gave Viking burial grounds a layer of meaning beyond death and beyond fear. They were not simply memorials to lives past. They were living nodes of influence, the hidden hands that shaped the fate of clans and communities. To disturb them was not merely to rob the dead, it was to challenge the authority of the living and the unseen alike. And that is why these mounds endured. They were guarded not just by curses, laws, and spirits, but by the enduring bond between the hero and his people, a bond strong enough to hold across centuries, unbroken, until the world itself changed. In the Viking mind, a burial mound was not only the resting place of the dead, it was a wellspring of power. To step onto its grassy slope was to step into a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, and where such boundaries thinned, magic was always close at hand. The Norse feared sorcery not because they doubted its existence, but because they were certain of it. Magic, say there, was a craft older than the sagas, tied to the will of the gods and the shadowed forces of the unseen world. It could heal the sick, foretell the future, call winds to a ship's sail, or destroy utterly, leaving a man broken in body or mind. Its power came from crossing those hidden lines between realms, and there were few places where such crossings were more potent than the mounds of the dead. It was believed that Seether worked most strongly in places where the living and the dead were close enough to touch, and the mound was such a place. Here, the magician could speak with the spirits, bargaining for knowledge or favor. Here, they could bind a curse, seal a spell into the earth, or draw strength from the power that lingered over the bones below. This made the burial mound a place of fear, as well as reverence. Villagers might leave offerings to the spirits resting there, but they were wary of those who lingered too long at its edge, or who visited in the hours when the sun was low. A lone figure on a mound at twilight might be a mourner, or it might be a Saith Kona, a woman skilled in magic, weaving her will into the bones of the dead. In the sagas, there are tales of witches and sorcerers who drew on the power of the grave. In Hrolf's saga Kraka, a sorceress conjures the spirit of a dead warrior to learn hidden truths. In Eyrbyggja's saga, a witch uses grave soil in her rites, believing it carries the essence of those buried within. These stories are never casual. They are warnings, reminders that such magic is dangerous, and that it often turns on the one who wields it. To the Vikings, the most perilous kind of Seether was that which bent the will of the dead. It was one thing to ask for their aid, it was another to compel it. The dead, once bound to a task, might not rest again, becoming restless spirits, Aptringur, who would haunt the living until released. Such magic could backfire, cursing not just the sorcerer but the entire community. The fear of sorcery was also bound to the fear of ill-wishers, those who would use mound magic to harm their enemies. A cunning enemy might steal a token from a grave, a weapon, a scrap of clothing, even soil, and use it to call the spirit of the dead against their foe. This belief made the theft of grave goods doubly dangerous. Not only did it risk angering the spirit, but it could place the stolen item in the hands of someone skilled enough to turn it into a weapon of magic. Because of this, communities were alert to signs of grave sorcery. A witch seen near a mound at night could be confronted, driven off, even killed for the sake of the clan's safety. The suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Archaeologists have found small ritual pits near certain mounds, containing burnt offerings, animal bones, and fragments of charms. These could be remnants of rites meant to win favor from the dead, or to bind their strength to a living master. Yet the relationship between magic and the mound was not always hostile. In the hands of a trusted Velva, a prophetess, the mound could be a place of sacred communion. The Velva might sit upon its crest, her staff in hand, her eyes closed, listening to the voices that rose from beneath. She might speak of the future, of omens in the coming harvest, of dangers that lay on the road ahead. Her role was both feared and honored, for her words could change the course of lives. Still, the association between the mound and magic meant that many would not approach after dark. The night was the time of Seether, when the unseen could walk more freely. Travelers who strayed too close spoke of strange lights glimmering over the grass, of voices that were not their own whispering in their ears. Some awoke in the morning with no memory of the night before, as if something had taken their will for a time. This wariness of sorcery became another reason Viking burial grounds remained untouched. The fear was not simply that the dead would rise, but that the living might use the dead for their own dark ends, and that in doing so, they might bring ruin to everyone nearby. Even centuries later, when the old magic was pushed aside by Christian priests, the suspicion lingered. Folk tales from the Middle Ages tell of witches seeking the power of the grave, of cursed mounds that brought death to those who built too close. The names of Saithkona and sorcerers faded, but the warnings remained. To disturb a burial mound was to risk becoming part of a sorcerer's tale, and not as the hero. Better to walk around, to leave the earth undisturbed, and to let both the dead and their magic lie in peace. The Vikings lived in a world where the bond between the living and the dead was not severed by the grave. It was a relationship that required tending, a pact that had to be honored if peace was to be kept between the two realms. One of the most visible expressions of that pact came in the form of seasonal offerings, gifts given at certain times of the year to nourish, honor, and appease those who slept beneath the mounds. The turning of the seasons was the drumbeat of Viking life. Long, dark winters gave way to short but intense summers, and each phase of the year carried its own customs and obligations. Just as the people made sacrifices to the gods for good harvests, safe voyages, and victory in battle, so too did they make offerings to their dead for guidance, protection, and the continuation of the family's fortune. One of the most important times for these rites was Jol, the midwinter festival. Before Christianity absorbed it into what we now think of as Christmas, Jol was a celebration of the rebirth of the sun, a turning of the year when the darkest days began to lengthen. It was a liminal time, the borders between the living and the dead thought to grow thin, allowing spirits to wander more freely. Families would gather in the warm glow of the longhouse, feasting and drinking in honor of both gods and ancestors. But the celebrations did not stay indoors. At Jol, it was common to carry food and drink to the burial mounds. A horn of ale might be poured into the earth, seeping down into the soil as a gift to the one who lay below. Flatbread, roasted meat, or even a handful of grain might be left on the mound's crest. These were not symbolic gestures. They were acts of literal hospitality. The dead were kin, and the same generosity shown to the living was expected for them. Spring brought another round of offerings. As the snow melted and the first shoots of green pushed through the frost-softened earth, farmers prepared their fields. Before the plows cut the soil, many would visit the mounds, asking the ancestors to bless the coming year's crops. Offerings at this time might include butter, milk, or the first eggs of the season, simple foods representing the renewal of life. In summer, during the height of the fishing and trading seasons, offerings could take on a more martial tone. Warriors departing on voyages might visit the mounds of famous fighters in their family, leaving small tokens: a spearhead, a piece of worked silver, a lock of hair. They asked for protection in battle and safe return across the seas. In some coastal communities, small boats carved of wood were placed on the mounds as symbolic vessels for the dead to aid their kin's journeys. Autumn, with its harvest feasts, was another time for offerings. The dead were thanked for their unseen aid through the growing season, their mounds decorated with sheaves of grain or the horns of animals slaughtered for the feast. This was also a time for storytelling. Families would gather near the mounds, recounting the deeds of the ancestors, binding their memory to the turning of the year. The offerings were not made only to the honored dead. Even those whose lives had ended in shame or misfortune were remembered, if only to ensure they stayed at peace. Neglecting a mound was thought to risk the return of a restless spirit, its discontent bringing sickness or bad luck to the living. Thus, even the graves of less beloved kin were given some mark of respect. The practice of seasonal offerings also reinforced the role of the burial mound as a social anchor. The act of visiting the mounds tied families to their land and their past, reminding them of the generations that had lived and died before them. It kept the names of the dead alive in memory, even as the physical traces of their lives faded. There was also a belief, rarely spoken but widely felt, that the offerings were a kind of exchange. The living gave food, drink, and gifts. The dead gave luck, protection, and fertility in return. If the offerings stopped, the benefits might stop as well, and so the cycle was maintained, year after year, century after century. Even after the coming of Christianity, when the church discouraged such pagan customs, the offerings did not vanish overnight. They shifted form, blending into the new faith. A farmer might light a candle at a mound instead of pouring ale. Bread left for the ancestors might be baked in the shape of a cross. Yet the act itself, the visiting, the giving, persisted. In the eyes of many, the old ways could live alongside the new, for the ancestors were still the ancestors, whatever god one prayed to. In the far rural reaches of Scandinavia, echoes of these rites survived well into modern times. In some places, it was still customary to leave a little of the juleöl, the Christmas ale, on the mound before drinking the rest. In others, families brought flowers to ancient graves in spring, speaking to the dead as if they might answer. These were quiet survivals, stripped of their overtly pagan frame, but they carried the same truth. The living still felt the need to honor the dead with the turning of the year. Seasonal offerings were more than superstition. They were acts of relationship, the tending of an invisible thread between generations. In giving to the dead, the living affirmed their place in a lineage stretching back to the earliest settlers of the land. And in receiving the blessings of the dead in a good harvest, a safe voyage, a victory in battle, they found proof that the bond still held strong. It was this ongoing exchange, as much as law or fear, that kept Viking burial grounds untouched for centuries. The mounds were not abandoned relics of a forgotten age, they were living points of connection, visited and fed, and spoken to in the rhythm of the seasons. To disturb them was not only to invite wrath, it was to break the cycle, to sever the link between past and present that gave meaning to life itself. For centuries, the people of the North told grim tales of those who dared disturb a burial mound and paid the price. These were not stories to pass a winter evening in idle amusement. They were warnings, carried from hall to hall, from farmstead to farmstead, until they became as much a part of the landscape as the mounds themselves. The Norse believed that to violate a grave was to tear a wound between the worlds. The dead, dishonored and restless, might rise to defend what was theirs, or to visit their fury upon the living. And unlike the living, the dead could afford to be patient. Their vengeance might fall in an hour, or it might stalk its victim for years. The sagas are rich with such accounts. In Grettis' saga Asmundarsonar, the hero Grettir hears of a mound said to hold a mighty sword. Against all counsel he goes to take it. As he pries open the chamber, the corpse of Kar the Old rises from the grave, armed with inhuman strength. They grapple in the dark, the dead man's grip cold as iron. Grettir wins, but only just, and the saga makes clear that his survival is the exception, not the rule. Most who dared such theft never returned. In Erbygja saga, there is the tale of Enyorolfr Bagafotre, Twist of Foot, a chieftain whose greed and temper in life were matched only by his malice in death. After his burial, strange misfortunes plague the district. Livestock vanish, men fall ill without cause, travelers disappear. The locals come to believe Forfar walks again. In the end, his body must be dug up and reburied far from men, yet even then, his spirit troubles the living. His mound becomes a place of dread, avoided by all. Such stories were not limited to the sagas. Farmers whispered of men who robbed a grave and afterward wasted away, struck by an illness no healer could name. Fishermen spoke of thieves whose boats capsized in calm water, the sea swallowing them without a trace. Sometimes the revenge was more subtle. A man's fortune might curdle, his crops fail, his kin die one by one, until his name was a curse on the wind. The form this vengeance took varied, but its cause was always the same: the breaking of the pact. A grave robbed was a promise broken, an insult hurled at the dead, and the dead, the Norse believed, had long memories. The most terrifying of these revenants was the draugar, the mound dweller. Unlike the shade that drifts like mist, the draugar could rise in solid form, stronger than any living man, impervious to ordinary weapons. They could crush a man's ribs with a single embrace or grind him into the earth. To fight one was to risk death many times over, and victory, even if it came, was never without a cost. But revenge did not always require a risen corpse. Sometimes it was enough for the dead to send signs: a shadow crossing a man's threshold at midnight, the sound of heavy breathing just behind his ear when he walked alone, dreams that left him waking in terror, the image of the mound fresh in his mind. These were omens that the dishonored dead were near, watching, waiting. There was also the belief that a dishonored dead could call misfortune from the unseen world: a storm that struck only one man's ship, a sickness that touched no one else in the household, a sudden madness that drove a man to ruin. Such things were taken as proof that the mound's guardian, whether ancestor, hero, or restless spirit, had loosed its wrath. The only way to end such vengeance, it was said, was through ritual appeasement. The living might return what had been taken, placing it back on the mound with gifts and words of apology. Sometimes an animal sacrifice was offered, its blood poured into the earth, to feed the spirit's hunger for restitution. In extreme cases, the mound was rebuilt, sealed anew as if the violation had never occurred. But even then, the stain of the deed might linger for generations, the family's luck forever tainted. The lesson was clear: some treasures were not meant for mortal hands. The sword in the mound, the silver arm ring on the corpse's wrist, the brooch gleaming in the half-dark, these belonged to another realm now, and to take them was to invite that realm's fury into your life. This belief was not mere superstition. It had teeth. The fear of the dead's revenge kept burial grounds untouched for centuries. In the Viking mind, the risk was not worth the gain. A man might grow rich by other means, but he could never outrun the vengeance of one who had been wronged in the grave. And so the mounds remained. They watched the seasons turn, felt the tread of men's boots pass by, but never break the soil. They became part of the unspoken map of the land, places you did not go unless you had reason, and even then, you went with care. Because in the north, everyone knew that the dead could forgive many things, but they would not forgive the theft of their peace. And those who tested that truth often learned it too late, as the cold breath of the grave closed over their shoulder. If you travel through the northern lands, across the fjordicut coasts, through the rolling farmlands, into the high, wind-swept hills, you begin to notice a pattern. Viking burial mounds are not placed just anywhere. They rise in places that seem apart from the living world, chosen with a precision that was as much spiritual as it was practical. Many mounds stand on ridges, visible for miles in every direction. From such heights, the dead look out over the land they once ruled, their mounds becoming landmarks in the truest sense. A sailor entering a fjord might see the crest of a great mound before the harbor itself, a silent greeting or warning from the shore. These high places were not merely scenic. They were difficult to reach, especially in winter, when snow turned the slopes into icy ramparts. Others lie far inland, deep in the folds of the land where narrow tracks wind through forests and marshes. To reach them, you must follow old paths that twist like streams, sometimes fading altogether in bog or undergrowth. In such places, the journey itself becomes a barrier. Every step feels like crossing deeper into a different realm, one quieter, older, and far from the hum of the living world. Coastal mounds often stand on isolated promontories, fingers of rock jutting into the sea. These sites are dangerous in foul weather, the waves below smashing themselves to white spray against the stone. To climb to such a mound is to court the sea's own wrath. Yet for a seafaring people, these sites had meaning. They marked the last sight of home for departing ships, and the first sign of return for those who made it back. Some burial grounds are set on islands, sometimes mere skerries, little more than bare rock, reachable only by boat. In summer they are lonely places, their grass bending in the wind, the water lapping gently at the shore. In winter the sea freezes between them and the mainland, but the ice is treacherous. To visit such a site out of season is to risk one's life. These island graves are perhaps the most untouched of all, for their remoteness keeps even the curious away. Then there are the mounds built beside natural boundaries, rivers, deep ravines, the edges of lakes. Water was a liminal thing to the Vikings, a threshold between here and elsewhere. To bury a man beside it was to place him on the border of the worlds. For the living, it was also a clever deterrent. The more difficult the approach, the fewer the intruders. The geographic isolation of many mounds was not accidental. It was a form of protection. The Norse understood that distance, hardship, and the hazards of nature could guard a grave as surely as curses and guardians. In a world without roads in the modern sense, even a journey of a few miles could become an ordeal if the weather turned foul or the snow fell heavy. This isolation also served a ceremonial purpose. Funerals were not held in the middle of village life. They were processions, journeys to carry the dead into the land of the dead. The burial ground itself was a destination, reached after hours, sometimes days of travel. This separation reinforced the idea that the dead now lived elsewhere, apart from the daily world. The choice of location was sometimes tied to the dead's own life. A chieftain who had commanded the sea might be buried where the tides whispered against the rocks. A warrior of the uplands might be laid in a cairn high above the tree line, where the wind sang in the stones. A wise woman might rest beside a spring, her grave fed by waters that seemed to run from another world. Because of these choices, many burial sites were naturally shielded from casual disturbance. Farmers could not simply turn a plow toward them. Traders could not pass by them on their daily routes. They lay in the slow places of the land, where the world seemed to move differently, and where superstition thrived. The remoteness also meant that stories grew around them unchecked. An isolated mound might be visible from a distance, its green hump catching the eye of shepherds or hunters. They might tell tales of strange lights dancing there at night, of figures seen standing atop it when no one could be found. Such tales traveled faster than any man could walk, reinforcing the mound's aura of danger. In this way, geography became as much a guardian as law or curse. The living placed their dead where the living would not go without reason, and then made sure those reasons were few. Over time, the land itself became part of the burial's defense. The slope too steep, the marsh too deep, the river too swift. Even the bravest might think twice before making the journey without good cause. And so, while the sea changed and the forest shifted, the mounds endured. They stood apart from the places of men, the quiet humps in the distance marking where the old ones slept. Isolation kept them safe when swords could not. It kept them sacred when fear alone might falter. And it ensured that for centuries, the treasures, bones, and memories within them would remain as they were on the day the mound was raised. The North remembers. It remembers in stone and in water, in the sweep of wind across the ridges and the heavy weight of snow on the fields. And it remembers in the slow, patient work of time, which has hidden and guarded the Viking burial mounds for more than 1,000 years. When the mounds were first raised, they stood proud against the horizon, raw earth piled high, fresh sod laid like a green crown over the grave. In the days after a burial, the mound would have been as visible as a fortress, the soil still loose underfoot, the shape unmistakable even from afar. But in the north, nothing stays new for long. The first to claim the mound was the weather. In spring, the rains would come, softening the earth, feeding the grass that rooted itself into the soil. In summer, the wind would sweep across it, carrying seeds from the hills and forests to settle on the mound's flanks. In autumn, the rains returned, swelling the moss, deepening the roots of whatever plants had taken hold. By winter, snow would blanket it all, smoothing the mound into a seamless white curve beneath the sky. Year after year, this cycle blurred the edges. Stones that had once stood in neat circles toppled under the weight of frost and thaw, then were hidden under creeping moss. Carved markers sank into the soil. The once sea's sharp rise of the mound became rounded, softened by centuries of growth. What had been a distinct monument began to look like any other rise in the land, at least, to the untrained eye. This natural disguise was one of the burial's greatest protections. By blending into the landscape, the mound escaped the gaze of those who might covet its riches. To a stranger passing through, it might be nothing more than a hillock or a swell of ground, shaped by wind and time. Only those who knew the land well, the local farmers, the herdsmen, the skalds, remembered which humps in the grass were the resting places of the dead. But memory, too, can fade. Harsh winters drove people from old lands, farms changed hands, paths shifted, and as the stories of the mounds grew fainter, some graves passed into obscurity entirely. In remote valleys and along forgotten coasts, there are mounds no one now names. The earth holds its secrets in silence. Weather did more than hide the mounds, it shaped them. Storms off the North Sea lashed the coasts, eroding the edges of promontories where some graves stood. Inland, torrential rains carved gullies into slopes, sometimes exposing timbers or stones from the burial chamber beneath. The wind scoured the highlands, stripping away topsoil until the bones of the earth and sometimes the bones of men were revealed. Yet for every mound lost to the violence of the elements, others were made stronger by them. Layers of soil, washed down from higher ground, settled over the mounds, sealing them tighter. Moss and lichen bound the stones together, protecting the chambers beneath from further weathering. The same frost that could shatter exposed rock also helped to compact the soil above the grave, locking it in place. Snow played its own role in preservation. In the long months of winter, a deep snowpack acted like a blanket, shielding the mound from the worst of the wind and from rapid changes in temperature that might crack the earth. Beneath this frozen cover, the mound lay in stillness, untouched until spring returned. Seasons were not the only agents of change. Centuries themselves left their mark. As the Viking Age gave way to later centuries, forests shifted. Some mounds once standing in open fields were swallowed by woods. Others that had been forest-bound were revealed when trees were cleared for pasture. In marshy lowlands, rising water sometimes cut mounds off from easy approach, making them small islands in a sea of reeds. The combination of nature's slow work and human movement turned many burial sites into ghost places. Their locations might be marked on no map, their presence betrayed only by a subtle swell in the land, or the strange way the grass grows there. To the old families, these were still known and respected, but to outsiders they were invisible. This invisibility was a shield. A grave that no one can find cannot be robbed. And even when such mounds were stumbled upon, the signs of age, the thick moss, the leaning stones, the tangled roots spoke of long years untouched, and that alone could be enough to stir caution in a trespasser's heart. Time, in this way, became as much a guardian as the draugar, the runes, or the landvatir. The slow erosion of detail, the fading of stories, the shifting of paths and settlements, all these work together to keep the mounds safe. Yet time is a double-edged sword. It preserves, but it also forgets. In saving the mounds from destruction, it sometimes severs them from the memory of those who built them. Today, archaeologists sometimes uncover burials that have lain unknown for centuries, their treasures and bones unseen since the day the mound was closed. To the people who raised them, these graves were sacred, tied to their very identity. Now they sleep nameless in the earth, their protection owed to nothing more than the patience of nature. And perhaps that is the final truth of weather and time in the Viking world. They do not simply guard, they transform. The mounds that dot the northern lands are not exactly as they were when first raised. They are older now, quieter, shaped by the seasons into part of the living land. In their softened forms, hidden among hills and heaths, they are at once relics of the past and enduring features of the present, silent testaments to lives once lived and a world long gone. In the Viking world, the dead were meant to rest undisturbed, yet there were times when the earth was moved, when old bones and grave goods came again into the light. Sometimes it happened by accident, a farmer plowing too deep in a forgotten field, a shepherd's dog digging at a mound's slope. Other times it was deliberate, a community seeking to honor an ancestor anew or to protect a burial threatened by the shifting land. When such a disturbance occurred, it was never treated lightly. The Norse understood that opening a grave was opening the boundary between the living and the dead. It was an act with consequences, and it demanded ritual to set things right again. This was the purpose of the undead, the reburial. Reburial was not common, but it was ancient. The first step was always acknowledgement. The living had crossed into the dead's domain. The bones would be handled with reverence, laid out and counted so none were lost. If grave goods were present, they would be cleaned and replaced, unless the family decided to add new offerings. These might be gifts of silver, a fine cloak, a new weapon, tokens, to reaffirm the respect owed to the one who slept there. The mound itself might be rebuilt from the ground up. Fresh earth was carried in baskets, tamped down by hand, the slope restored to its old shape. Stones marking the grave were reset, or new ones brought from places of significance, a river where the dead had fished, a mountain path they had once walked. This rebuilding was more than construction. It was the sealing of the wound that had been opened between worlds. Before the last layer of earth was placed, rites were performed. The family skald might recite the deeds of the one being reburied, calling their name so it would not fade from memory. A priest of the old ways might speak to the gods, asking for their blessing and for the dead's peace. If the family followed the new Christian faith, a priest might offer prayers, sprinkling holy water over the bones. In some places and times, both rites were performed side by side, the old and the new, woven together in the hope that all powers would guard the grave. Offerings were often part of the reburial. A bowl of ale poured into the soil, a slaughtered animal, its blood spilled on the mound. In coastal communities, the head of a fish or seal might be placed on the grave as a gift from the sea. These were not for show. They were believed to nourish and strengthen the spirit for its continued journey in the other world. The reburial also served the living. It reaffirmed the bond between the community and its dead. To restore a grave was to say, "We remember you. You are still one of us." It was a renewal of the pact that kept the peace between realms. There are tales in the sagas of reburial done to quiet a restless spirit. In Erbygja saga, the body of the troublemaking chieftain, Hjorfr Bagifotru, is dug up after his haunting spreads across the district. He is reburied far from men, in a place where the land meets the sea, his mound rebuilt and sealed tight. Only then do the hauntings cease. Sometimes reburial was an act of protection. Coastal erosion might threaten to carry a mound into the sea, or a river might change course and eat away at its banks. In such cases, the bones would be moved to safer ground, often higher and farther from human paths. The move was done with all the care of the original burial, for to mishandle the remains was to risk drawing the spirit's ire. There was also the rare but notable practice of merging graves, placing the remains of a newly dead kinsman in the mound of a revered ancestor. This was not done for convenience, but for honor. To share a grave was to share fate. It tied the newer burial to the older one's prestige, and it placed both under the same watch in the afterlife. In every case, the act of reburial was a reminder of the living's responsibility. The dead had been entrusted to the earth, and the earth to the care of the living. If that trust was broken by accident or necessity, it had to be repaired with respect, labor, and offerings. Only then could the door between worlds be closed again. Even now, when archaeologists uncover Viking burials, they sometimes find signs of ancient reburial, soil layers that do not match the original construction, stones moved and reset, grave goods that seem newer than the bones they accompany. These speak of hands that returned to the grave long after the funeral fires had gone cold, hands that knew the importance of putting the dead to rest a second time. The ritual of reburial was not about hiding what had been done. It was about making it right. For in the North, everyone knew that the peace of the dead was the foundation of the peace of the living. And without that peace, no hall, no farm, no kingdom could stand for long. The Viking world did not remain untouched forever. Across the centuries, sails from the south began to appear in northern waters, not the dragon-proud ships of raiders, but the square-rigged cogs of merchants and missionaries. These new arrivals brought goods, ideas, and a new faith: Christianity. At first, the old and new ways existed side by side. A chieftain might be baptized by a foreign priest, yet still pour ale onto the mound of his ancestors at Joel. A farmer might wear a cross around his neck but keep a Thor's hammer hidden beneath his shirt. And when the dead were buried, the customs of the old gods often mingled with the rites of the new Christ. The Christian burial was simple by comparison to the grand rites of the Norse. The body was placed in the earth, often without grave goods, oriented east-west toward the rising sun, awaiting the day of resurrection. The pagan mound, in contrast, was a fortress of memory rich with offerings, weapons, and the possessions of the dead. In theory, the church frowned upon these pagan practices. In practice, change came slowly. The missionaries were clever. They knew that the quickest way to win the hearts of the Norse was not to destroy their customs outright, but to sanctify them in Christian form. Old burial grounds were blessed, their mounds left standing as the dead within were declared at rest in Christ. In some places, small wooden crosses were planted atop the mounds, turning them into hybrid memorials, part pagan, part Christian. Over time, the church built chapels near or even upon ancient burial sites, linking the holy presence of the saints to the remembered presence of the ancestors. Families could continue to gather near their mounds, now under the gaze of the crucifix, as well as the eyes of the dead. The offerings changed: bread, blessed by the priest, candles lit on feast days, but the act of honoring the dead endured. Still, there were moments of open conflict. Some zealous priests declared the mounds to be places of demonic power, demanding they be leveled. A few communities obeyed, dismantling the earthworks and scattering the stones. But in most cases, resistance was quiet and effective. The mounds were left alone, explained away as old memorials of no religious danger. Even the most devout Christians hesitated to disturb them, whether from lingering fear of the old curses or from simple respect for their forebears. The arrival of Christianity also altered the meaning of grave robbing. In pagan law, to violate a mound was to offend the dead and their kin. In Christian law, it became a sin against God as well, the desecration of a burial ground consecrated by holy rites. The penalty was still severe, but now it carried the added weight of eternal damnation. Despite these changes, the mounds endured. In part, it was because they had become part of the landscape itself. Even to Christian eyes, they were monuments of the past, reminders of the great men and women who had shaped the land. A priest might preach against pagan rites, but he could hardly deny the ancestral pride bound up in those green-crowned hills, and so a curious blending took place. In some villages, the old seasonal offerings continued, but under new names. Ale poured into the earth at Yule became a toast in memory of the dead. Bread left on the mound in spring was said to be for the poor souls in purgatory. the meaning remained, even if the words had changed. Christianity also brought new layers of sanctity to the burial grounds. Graves near the church were especially revered, and in some cases the mounds themselves became markers of land held in the name of the church. This added yet another barrier against disturbance. To rob a mound was now to defy both God and man. Archaeology shows the gradual blending of these traditions. In some lady Viking burials, a cross is found alongside a Thor's hammer, the two symbols lying together, as if in silent truce. A warrior might be buried without his weapons, but with a carved runestone nearby, bearing both Christian and pagan imagery. Even as the faith of the North shifted, the reverence for the mound as a resting place did not vanish. In the end, Christianity did not erase the Viking burial mounds. It changed their story, added new prayers to their keeping, and sometimes tried to claim them for its own. But it could not uproot the deep respect the Norse held for the bond between the living and the dead. Thus, even as churches rose and bells rang where once the skalds sang to Odin, the mounds remained. Some bore crosses, others still carried the whisper of the old gods, and many carried both. But all stood untouched, as they had for centuries green watchtowers over a land where faiths might change. But memory never died. For centuries, Viking burial mounds had stood inviolate, guarded by law, fear, curses, and the deep respect for the pact between the living and the dead. But no taboo holds forever. Slowly, over the long march of time, the first cracks appeared. It did not happen during the Viking Age itself. In those centuries, to rob a mound was to invite destruction from kin, from law, from the restless dead. But as generations passed, the sagas slipped further into the realm of story, and the old fears began to fray. The faith of the North had shifted to Christianity, and though many old beliefs lingered, the certainty of the draugar and the landvatter no longer held all hearts in check. The earliest grave robbers were not strangers to the land. They were locals, men who knew the mounds by name, who had grown up hearing the warnings, but who had begun to doubt them. Hunger, greed, or desperation could drive them to test the ancient rules. Some may have convinced themselves that the old protections no longer worked. Others may have told themselves that the dead had no need of gold. Yet even then, the act was dangerous. Grave robbing in the medieval North was a crime against both the community and the church. If caught, a man could be exiled, executed, or branded for life. For this reason, the early robbers worked in secret, often under the cover of night, with only a few trusted accomplices. We know of some of them through archaeology. When modern excavations open certain mounds, they find signs of earlier intrusion. The burial chamber breached, a scatter of disturbed bones, missing valuables. But more often than not, the robbers took surprisingly little. Sometimes a single sword was missing, or one ornate brooch, or a silver cup, while the rest of the treasures lay untouched. Why so little? Some scholars believe that even the boldest early robbers were not free of fear. They might enter a mound, take one item, and then feel the weight of the place pressing down on them, the cold air, the strange stillness, the sense that something was watching. In that moment, courage faltered. They fled with the smallest thing at hand, unwilling to tempt fate further. In other cases, the robbers may have sought only specific items, believing them to hold magical power. A sword from a warrior's grave was not merely steel, it was thought to carry the warrior's strength. A brooch from a wise woman's mound might confer her luck or her sight. Such relics were prized, not for their value in silver, but for the unseen power they were believed to contain. There were also professional tomb raiders. In the later Middle Ages, as trade routes widened and the wealth of the past began to be seen as a resource, some individuals and small bands made a living by plundering ancient graves. These men were often outsiders, traveling from place to place. Unlike locals, they had no ties to the dead beneath the mounds, and thus no loyalty to their memory. To them, a grave was not sacred ground but an unopened chest. Even so, many of these early professional robbers met grim ends. Chronicles tell of men struck down by sudden illness after such raids, or found dead in their beds, with expressions of terror still on their faces. Whether from disease, accident, or the vengeance of the dead, the result was the same. The tales of their fate traveled quickly, reinforcing the old fears. One story from the Danish island of Funen tells of a pair of brothers who, in the early 14th century, dug into a mound, said to hold the grave of an ancient chieftain. They returned home with gold arm rings and a carved drinking horn. Within a month, both were dead, one drowned in calm water, the other crushed when the roof of his barn collapsed in still weather. The locals needed no further proof. The mound, they said, had claimed them. Because of such tales, grave robbing remained rare for many centuries after the Viking Age. It was not until the modern era, the 18th and 19th centuries, that the taboo truly broke. By then, the old beliefs had weakened further, and antiquarians and treasure hunters began to see the mounds as places to be studied, opened, and claimed. Some sought scholarly knowledge, others sought wealth. In both cases, the results were the same. The dead were disturbed. But the first grave robbers, those who broke the silence in the centuries after the Vikings themselves, were stepping into a space still heavy with the old power. They were the ones who tested the boundary when it still stood strong, when the mounds were still feared. And whether they returned with gold or with nothing at all, they left behind a legacy of unease. For the Norse, the mound was a closed door between worlds. These first robbers, by opening it, became part of its story. And their story was almost always a warning that some doors, once opened, cannot easily be shut. Across the windswept lands of the north they remain. Long after the last funeral fire burned low, long after the voices that sang the old songs fell silent, the mounds still rise from the earth, patient, immovable, watching. Some stand on high ridges, catching the first light of dawn and the last glow of dusk. From these heights they look out over fields, forests, and fjords, their presence as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. Others lie in quiet meadows where cattle graze, their green flanks soft underfoot, their curves blending into the gentle undulations of the land. In forests, the mounds are half hidden under roots and moss, their outlines only visible when the low winter sun casts shadows across the leaf-strewn ground. Along the coasts, they weather the endless breath of the sea, the wind drawing lines of silvered grass across their crowns. On remote islands, they stand solitary, visited only by gulls and the shifting tides. Many of these mounds have never been opened. No spade has broken their surface. No curious hand has disturbed the treasures, bones, and memories they hold. They have been spared by 1,000 years of fear, reverence, and the quiet work of forgetting. In some cases, the people nearby know their stories, still the names of the dead, the deeds that earned them such honor. In others, the mounds have become part of the nameless past, their builders remembered only as the old ones. Even today, there is an unspoken caution about them. Farmers plow around them. Builders leave them standing when roads are laid. Hikers feel a subtle tightening in the chest when they crest a hill and find one waiting, silent and still. It is not always fear. Sometimes it is respect, or the faint stirring of something older, the sense that you are standing in a place where the living and the dead still share the ground. Archaeologists tread lightly around these untouched mounds. The science they serve demands careful excavation, but even the most seasoned researchers know that breaking into a mound is a kind of trespass. Before the first shovel's edge cuts the sod, there is always a pause, an unspoken recognition that they are crossing a threshold that has stood closed for a millennium. In recent years, modern scanning technology has allowed us to look inside some of these mounds without opening them. What the images reveal is astonishing. ships buried intact beneath layers of earth, chambers filled with goods from distant lands, human remains resting as they were laid, weapons still at their sides. The treasures are real, but they are only part of the story. The greater treasure is the unbroken connection between those who built the mounds and the land that still holds them. For the people of the Viking Age, the mound was more than a grave. It was a promise that the dead would be remembered, that their resting place would be kept whole, that the bond between the living and the dead would not be broken. That promise has been kept longer than any of them could have imagined. In 1,000 years, the world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have risen and fallen. Faiths have come and gone. The old longships have rotted into the sea, and the halls of the jarls stand only as ruins. But the mounds endure. They have outlasted kings, plagues, wars, and the slow, grinding erosion of time. They endure because the people who came after the Vikings, farmers, priests, kings, and common folk, each found their own reason to leave them alone. For some it was fear of the dead's revenge. For others it was respect for the law or loyalty to the ancestors. For many, it was simply that the mounds had become part of the land's soul, and to destroy them would be to wound the land itself. Even now, in an age when their treasures could be sold for fortunes and their bones studied for secrets of the past, there are mounds that no one dares to touch. They stand as they always have, green and silent under the turning sky, the grass bending in the wind above them. And perhaps that is how it should be, for what the mounds protect is more than gold, more than weapons, more than the remains of kings and warriors. They protect a story, the story of a people who understood that the dead are not gone, only gone ahead, that the living owe them care, and that the bond between the worlds is as real as the bond between parent and child, brother and sister, chieftain and clan. It is a story written not in ink or stone, but in the enduring presence of these silent hills. And so long as the mounds stand, the story remains unbroken. The wind will still pass over them. The snow will still crown them in winter. The sun will still rise and fall on their slopes. And in that quiet rhythm, the pact between the living and the dead, the pact that kept Viking burial grounds untouched for centuries, will hold.